Okay, perfect. All right. So, welcome to our Hormone Masterclass. And I love the conversation we were having ahead of time today, just talking about those things, right? Where something is just not right, where you've maybe been told this is just something you have to live with, or there's a medication for that. And I just want to bring attention to some of the things that are not just a medication, right? Or a pill for an ill, or a let's put a band aid on it. So sometimes we hear labs are fine, right? And they just don't tell the whole picture. So, welcome. I am your host for today, Dr. Jenny Cortano. A little bit of background about me: I've been in healthcare for 17 years and really have worked a lot in rehabilitation and working with young families. And what I was seeing at home and dealing with in my own life as I paralleled those things was moms dealing with all the same stuff, right? I'm constantly exhausted. It translates over into not having energy for my kids or my spouse, or I can't lose the weight, or I'm just not sleeping well, and all of those other things. And so I feel like I bring that gift of having an understanding for science and being able to share that and translate it into something meaningful for women in particular, in this case, to be able to get that energy back in your day with energy to spare. I mean, I really feel like since I've gotten on this track and been able to support my own hormones and with the women I work with, it's not, I'm crawling to bedtime anymore. Like, right, I've got energy left and I feel good about my day. So I'm hoping we can create that for you guys as well. So let's get started here. All right. So, a little bit about what we're going to go over today. I want you to understand why your hormones can be normal even when you don't feel normal. And I say normal in quotations because I think normal is a continuum. And for you, if you don't feel good, then there's something off. But let's discuss why, maybe some better ways to measure hormones, and then common symptom presentations of different hormone issues. And then we're going to wrap up with the so what, right? So, what can I do about all that information? What are some things you can do today at home in your day to day to start to fix that and get back on track? All right. So, when we talk about labs, here is why so many labs might miss the mark. Oftentimes, when your practitioner, if you get lucky enough to find somebody who's going to test those labs for you, will send you to get a lab test. And they do look at that at one peak point in time. But here's what happens with your hormones. So, different hormones over the period of your cycle. You could see the average cycle here, 28 days. We can see those hormones rise and fall depending on where you are in your cycle. So, what you might get is a within normal range reading, but maybe that's not normal for this period in your cycle. For example, if we're talking about this hormone here in orange, if you get this reading, but you're at this point in your cycle, it is not normal, right? It might be part of what's causing your symptoms. It might tell part of the story, but you're not going to know that necessarily unless you do something that is a little more targeted and takes into account your full cycle and where your hormones should be at different points in that cycle. So that's one issue that we have with our labs in general. Here's another, right? This is again cortisol. So the other one was more of our sex hormones. This is our cortisol hormones. Normal isn't optimal, first of all, right? So there's a big range here of normal, and your symptoms matter. But this might be normal for a lot of folks, right? When they do these, they take a whole lot of people and say, okay, this is a normal range. But maybe for you, you're actually waking up later. And so this graph should be shifted. And if they're taking your labs at 9 or 10 in the morning, you might not fit in this, right? So there's lots of different things that can impact what that one draw in time is telling us about our hormones. Likewise, here you see that graph over the entire 24-hour period. And this is what it should do. For example, cortisol is your stress hormone, right? And we need cortisol. We often think of it as being a bad thing. But the reality is, cortisol is really important for a lot of things in our life. But it shouldn't be high all day, or it shouldn't be tanking at night. And if we are losing our cortisol, then oftentimes our melatonin is higher. We're going to feel more tired. So if you're dropping that cortisol in the afternoon, you might feel exhausted every afternoon. And this might be part of the story. But if you only test that at one point in time in the morning, you're just not going to know. So, why is that important? Well, here is just a bigger picture of estrogen and what happens with your estrogen in your body. And I show you this not because I want you to understand this whole process, although this is something we look at when we talk about hormones. I want you to appreciate there's a whole lot of different things here. So, first of all, in pink, we have not just one type of estrogen, but two and then three. And those should do different things at different points in our body. So, if we're not testing E1, E2, and E3, we don't actually know what our estrogen or in this case, right, our sex hormones looks like. Likewise, we have all of these cofactors that are necessary to break it down. So, this is the 2-OH pathway, the 4-OH pathway, and the 16-OH pathway. And each of those are going to do different things with the estrogens in our body, and they mean different things. They're going to detox differently. They're going to place us at increased risk for things like cancer and other things if they're not working, right? And so, those are big, scary things. But the reality is, the more information we have, the more we know about how our bodies function, the more we can do to offset that, to fix it, and to get ourselves feeling well. A couple other things that I think are worth pointing out here. So, first of all, is the gut component of this, right? And we often think, well, what does my gut have to do with my hormones? A ton, right? So, what's happening in your gut can create either increased risk of hormone problems or decreased risk of hormone problems. And so, things like oral contraceptives can contribute to that. Potentially meat or dairy. Some folks, gluten, right? Leaky gut is a term that's become very popular, but the reality is that has a huge impact on how our hormones function. Taking a step back and thinking for a minute, our hormones are a communication system for our body. So if our body system is disrupted in any way, in this case, maybe a gut issue, those hormones are going to change and they're going to be off. And there are a lot of other lifestyle factors that can influence that as well. So, for example, if we're always stressed, that's going to shift things. Our body says, well, we must need more of those stress hormones, right? And you're going to shift that away from these sex hormones in this case. So, lots of different things that can influence how our body feels. This being one of them, the gut, right? Another one over here that I want to point out is excretion. Oftentimes, when we talk about getting things out of our body, I've had people tell me, yeah, I'm regular. Okay, what does that mean? Well, I go to the bathroom a few times a week. No, you should be pooping 1 to 3 times a day. And if you're not, then we probably have a backup of things being reabsorbed in your body. And again, that can increase or change the way our hormones function. Another one is exercise, right? Exercise is a great way to detox our body. And so, if we're not getting our heart rate up regularly, moving things through that exchange of respiration and sweat, we might be holding on to toxins that are influencing our hormones. And then up here, we talk a little bit about tissues, but just in general, I want to appreciate that so many things that happen in our body are going to contribute to that communication with our hormones as well. And so in this case, we're talking about all kinds of things, but I want to draw attention to one that's recently been studied more and more, and that is our fat tissue. Our fat tissue actually serves as its own communication and regulates its own hormones. And so we can have estrogen issues if we have too much fat tissue, for example, right? And so, and then it becomes this nasty cycle. We get more estrogen, we get more fat, we get more estrogen, we get more fat. And that is a problem, right? And this is why a lot of women will say, I cannot get rid of this midsection fat, right? Because our estrogen is feeding into and communicating with our fat tissue and vice versa. So there's, lots of body types out there, lots of things that I'm not a proponent of restricting diet and all of those things, but it is super important to maintain a healthy weight, healthy lifestyle in order for us to get our tissues to communicate regularly with the rest of our body. And then of course all of our sex components, our thyroid, all of those things are communication centers as well, right? So all of those are going to contribute to not just this picture, but what those hormones in general in our body do. All right. So moving on then, in order to fully look at our hormones, we have to consider really more than just what oftentimes people come to us saying is sex hormones, right? Which is your estrogen, your progesterone, your testosterone. You've got to consider that cortisol. And as I alluded to earlier, your body starts from kind of a similar pathway with those. If you're having a lot of stress, your body's going to say, well, I must need to make more cortisol, right? And if you think about cortisol, cortisol comes in or should come in when we need it, right? So it's going to help wake you up in the morning. That's a positive of it. Our cortisol is going to go up when we exercise, again, to help just contribute to our ability for our body to perform. But we live in a day and age now where we're stressed about everything all the time. We're attached to our phones, everything's high. And so that cortisol tends to, for many people, creep up and up and up and up. We have stress all the time. We perceive stress, and then we've ingrained those pathways and just strengthen that, right? And it's like a muscle. So now we've strengthened this cortisol pathway so that anytime we think about stress, boom, we have cortisol. Well, that is going to steal a lot of information, resources, and support from our sex hormones. So then we hear things like, I have no sex drive. I've got dryness. I've got chronic pain and symptoms, right? And so All of that can be related to sex hormone dysfunction, but a lot of times there's a cortisol component to it. And at least we need to look at it as a whole picture when we think about our sex hormones. And then the last one we have to consider is insulin. The reason insulin is so important, and insulin, if you're thinking about this, you're probably thinking, what? This is part of my blood sugar regulation, right? Well, that is really important, and that is the key of insulin. But what happens when insulin is involved is it affects your cortisol. So when we have, drops in our insulin levels, it's going to actually dump cortisol. So now we've increased that cortisol again in a different way. And so if we aren't looking at the gut health, what we're eating in our diet, and how it's affecting our blood sugar regulation, we are going to throw off this whole system as well. So, what do we do about that then? Well, oftentimes, what I recommend and what I think is most valuable is looking at a functional lab test, such as a Dutch test, which will give you a better picture of your cortisol and your hormones. And oftentimes, when folks have come to me, they've already been to their physician, they've already looked at their basic labs, and so they know that everything looks fine now, right? So, we can consider all of those things and have a better idea just talking about lifestyle what else might be going on with insulin and other areas of the body, but we can get a much better and more targeted picture of what actually happens with cortisol and those sex hormones, like we just looked at throughout that 24 period. Okay, so why do we need that? Well, oftentimes people coming in will say, I've got breast tenderness, irritability, irregular periods, no periods, mood swings, mental fog, decreased sex drive, vaginal dryness, right? You can see there's a ton of overlap between these symptoms. So it's not easy to pinpoint, is this a high estrogen issue? Is this a low estrogen issue? Is it a progesterone issue? There is so many variables that aren't clear. And so testing gives us more information on what to do with that. But let's just say for a minute we start to take some of those symptoms or those symptoms of maybe a cortisol presentation, right? So same things, right? We might be able to clarify a little bit easier. Is this anxiety, poor sleep, or is it a never rested, low cortisol issue? But if we don't actually dive into the test and figure out, is it that you're, for example, if you have a high cortisol issue, are you making too much of it? Or are you not breaking it down quickly enough? And so too much is hanging around in your body. If you're making too much of it, we can slow that process down. That's great. But if you're not detoxing it, then you're still going to have the same symptoms. On the flip side, maybe you make plenty of it, but you're breaking it down too quickly. So if we make more of it, you might feel more jittery, more anxious, but also still not rested and have low energy. So testing really helps us get to the root of why do you feel the way you feel? And then we can start to look, in addition to being more targeted and more intentional about what's going on, at what else is going on in your life. And so appreciating that your body is one component of that, but your body responds to everything else we do around it, right? So why is your cortisol high or why is your estrogen high? And so these are some of the things that can impact you. When we talk about, and we'll dive in a little bit more to natural ways here, but thinking about stress, thinking about what we're putting into our body that's affecting that gut permeability or that insulin level. Chemicals. And I think there's chemicals in just about everything, right? It's really hard to find clean products from makeup to skincare to laundry detergent to household cleaners. There is a ton of chemicals, and a lot of those are known disruptors. Same thing with our food. There's a ton of glyphosate, which is basically Roundup, that gets leaked into our food. And we know that's a natural hormone disruptor. It actually affects some pretty wild things when we look at the animal studies in terms of sex changes and animals and things like that, right? I'm not saying that's what's happening in humans, but appreciating if it has that big of an impact on an animal that's living in that environment, it's having that impact on us too. Alcohol is another big one. So, are we drinking a lot? Are we taking in good, healthy things? Are we drinking too much alcohol, which in and of itself is an endocrine disruptor and will affect your hormones? And then you have too much plastic. Plastics, again, is another one. With plastic that we store our food in, plastic that we're walking around with, receipts actually are one of the biggest issues. So, that film that you have on your receipt that makes it hard to write on actually is a plastic that will very easily leak through your skin and into your system and affect your hormones as well. So we take all that information we learned from the lab testing, look at what's actually happening in your body, and then we can apply these natural things. Now, you don't have that lab test today or you're not ready, these are some things you can naturally do to start to correct your hormones. And we're going to dive into each of these, but appreciating that it all starts in the gut, right? So our gut is the biggest contributor to our communication system in our body. And so if we're communicating something that's going to raise our insulin by having a lot of high sugary foods, or we've got leaky gut from, who knows, right? A lot of us have leaky gut related issues. And I know that's become a very big buzzword, but at the same time, we're perpetuating it with our poor diets. So, kind of getting through what's going on in our gut that's influencing that communication system, our hormones in our body. Another one is stress. Like I mentioned, I think women in general today are always on, right? You're a mother, you're, you know, running the household, you're running your job, you're running yourself insane, right? And trying to find time for yourself and all of that. That stress level just continues to layer it on. And, I feel like this is something that we really, really are strong about. But I think even for women and myself included, who think I'm doing a really great job managing it, the reality is we have way more on our plate than we're ever going to be able to manage in a day. And it almost always creates a system of stress, whether that's stress thinking about what I didn't get done today, stress feeling guilty about not giving everything 100%, just the stress of all of the things we do in a day, the social media, right? So between always being on it, but also always having this perception of what other people are creating as this perfect life. And then we create an assumption for ourselves that we should be there as well. And so all of those things are really challenging and can contribute to those feelings of stress. And it might be subtle, but it layers on, and that can affect our hormones in a tremendous way as well. Moving every day. And there's, the cool concept about this is it doesn't have to be exercise, right? Some people say, I don't have time for that. That's okay. Start with what you can. Maybe that's parking a little farther away from Publix and walking in, or, making time to walk the dogs at night so that you get a few more steps in your day. There's this really cool thing that basically is non aerobic exercise thermogenesis, meaning our body heats up and we have that exchange of toxins, even with a low level movement of those things I just described. So it's actually a scientific term and something I strongly promote in anybody I'm working with. Sometimes we only have 5 extra minutes in our day, and maybe that just means we walk past the mailbox a few extra feet, get a few more steps in before we head back to the house. And that's okay. But move every day. Cleaning up our routine, and we'll talk a little bit more about that when we get to that slide as well. Getting plenty of sleep, and that I think is always a big stressor as well, and the quality of your sleep. So next to the gut, I would say this is another huge one. We do a lot of detoxing at night, and so our body's ability to reset and rebuild those communication tools really happens when we're sleeping. And then, of course, supplementing when we need to, and we'll talk about that as well. So let's dive into each of those a little bit more. Oftentimes when we talk about gut health, I think, people assume like I'm doing pretty well, but there are so many inflammatory markers that can affect our insulin and our cortisol levels. And so we really want to get rid of any inflammation. And even if that's for a period of time, just to kind of reset. So inflammation oftentimes comes from maybe our extra sugars is a big one. Having the wrong kinds of fat, so having a lot of processed food, which are going to have your seed oils and vegetable oils in them, those are going to increase inflammation. Gluten and dairy for a lot of people, and that doesn't mean you can't have it ever, but oftentimes if we go through a period of reset, that can be huge in kind of resetting that inflammation marker, which is going to then bring down your insulin, regulate your cortisol, and your body can start to shift things back over to those sex hormones to regulate those instead of being in the survival mode. Eliminating any dysbiosis. And you might be thinking, well, what does that mean? That's definitely something we need to sit down and talk about. But for anybody who complains about bloating, belching, heartburn, any of those kinds of things, I think oftentimes we need to take a deeper look at what's actually going on in the stomach, because that can be such a trigger for inflammation. And we want to make sure that we have enough healthy bacteria in there and that we're feeding them the right things, right? So healthy bacteria in our gut actually outnumber the cells in our body, and they're huge for creating communication in our bodies. So we know that there are certain ones that are linked with, for example, diabetes or sugar balancing. We know there are some that are linked with mental health. With weight management, actually, right? So Ozempic is such a big deal nowadays. We know that there are certain bacteria in the gut that actually will produce the same chemical as what Ozempic produces. So getting the right things in there. Maybe that means supplementing with a probiotic. Maybe that means just um, feeding the good guys you have, right? But I think it's a balance, right? And finding what's reasonable for you. Feeding them plenty of colors. They love the fruits and vegetables, lots of fiber, and getting the right things in our body. But then also, as women, we really need plenty of protein and fats. Those are going to help stabilize our blood sugar. They're going to keep our muscle on, which is going to help with all those hormones as well. And so those are two big important things, particularly as we age, is avoiding a lot of carbohydrates, and particularly the refined sugar ones, the breads, the baked goods, all those tasty things that are not so healthy for our gut, and making sure we get the right things in instead. And then the last one, of course, is staying regular, because anytime we have a backup of the stuff we're supposed to get out of our body, we run the risk of creating this recirculation of toxins, which can then increase that inflammation all the way around. Okay. The next one I always like to talk about is stress, because I think these are being addressed kind of in order of importance here. Um, Stress is huge, right? And like we said, it increases that cortisol, and so it's necessary, but we still need to keep it in check. And our cortisol staying high throughout the day is going to affect our melatonin production. So many times people will say, "Oh, I take melatonin, I sleep better at night." Well, oftentimes that means that we're not getting enough of that cortisol regulation throughout the day to create the melatonin we need. So one simple thing you can do is get outside first thing in the morning to help that path I looked at earlier, where cortisol rises in the morning and then falls throughout the day until its lowest point at night, and then repeats that cycle. So getting outside first thing in the morning to get a little bit of sunlight can actually help set those circadian rhythms, which will help with your cortisol and your melatonin. But being intentional about stress management is huge. So whether it's physical stress, mental stress, emotional stress. And you might think, I'm not stressed, but you're working out 5 days a week and your body is tanking because of the intensity of the physical stress you're under, right? Oftentimes, I mentioned earlier, was more that mental and emotional stress, and it can be real or imagined. And when I say that, I mean, if you're the type of person that gets nervous about something coming, so let's say you've got a meeting with your boss tomorrow, you're already worried about it, you've conjured up the worst in your head, that is creating stress and cortisol for you. And that's not even a real stress, right? It might be, but you don't even know. You haven't gotten to the meeting yet. It's only what you've created. And so that can increase the cortisol just by imagining the stress. And then unfortunately, the way our bodies work, those pathways are strengthened. So the more stress we have, the more stress response we get in general to things, the more cortisol our body gets used to dumping. And so now we've thrown off that whole hormone balance because of our stress level chronically being raised. Worst case scenario for people who have been doing this for a long time, they'll actually have basically what we call adrenal insufficiency or adrenal fatigue, where over time you've just produced so much and your body's been working so hard that it kind of stops, right? And now we have no stress response, we have no cortisol left. That is not a good place to be, right? Now, these people are constantly complaining of being tired, low energy, just struggling to get through the day. And oftentimes that can be from kind of this adrenal overload and cortisol fatigue. Okay, so I just mentioned not overdoing it, but exercising daily is important. And that's really important for that exchange of toxins. So, our body uses everything and then creates these byproducts we have to get rid of. And so being regular is huge for that. But exercise hits two of them, really sweat and respiration. And then oftentimes exercise will promote that digestion as well. So we really hit on all three by moving our body every day. And again, if you're starting from nothing, don't overdo it. Going for short walks, moving your body is huge, and finding something you enjoy that you're going to stick with is really important. Okay, so next one I'm going to talk about is just in general taking a look at the products you use in your house. And before you get overwhelmed, you can't get rid of everything all at once, but picking one place and starting. So maybe that's your health and beauty routine, reading the labels, checking the ingredients. There's some good brands out there, there's some better brands out there. There might be something that you're like, I just can't live without this. And that's okay. Remove something else, right? I'm a big fan of the 80-20 rule when it comes to most things in life. If we can get rid of 80% of the bad stuff and we keep 20%, whether that be an enjoyable meal out that's going to be more inflammatory, or your mascara you just can't let go of because it's your favorite, that's okay. Let's fix the ones we can. And so, diving into what's really in your products, finding out using some of the apps that are out there, like the Yucca app is a good one, or Think Dirty. None of them are perfect, but they can give you a better idea of what's in your products that you're using and go ahead and start cleaning those out. Cleaning products are another one, right? Almost all of them have fragrance in them. And unfortunately, fragrance is usually a cover and is allowed to be a cover for just about anything. So we want to be able to get rid of the things that aren't so great. I've got a couple of brands that I prefer for our cleaning products that I think are just cleaner and going to give us a better opportunity to not impact our hormones, especially if this is something you're struggling with. Taking a look at our food and beverages, in particular, when we talk about toxins, how are they stored? So plastic or any sort of packaging is going to potentially load up the chemicals. Like I mentioned earlier, a lot of our grain-based products have a lot of glyphosate in them, which can definitely impact our hormones as well. It's actually pretty wild, the numbers that we're seeing in terms of how much contamination there is in our food products. So, not that we have to choose organic all the time, but choosing the things that are going to be better choices for us, eliminating the processed food when possible. And when we are choosing it, maybe choosing either organic products or a less packaged product and things like that. And then lawn maintenance is another one, right? If you've got a lawn service, they're probably using a whole lot of chemicals out there that you may or may not want. Finding somebody else that's going to do something different. There are some natural ones out there that, again, are going to be less impactful to your hormones. So just being aware of it is step one, and then starting to make those slow changes beyond that. And then I said I was doing these in order of importance, but I should have put this one at the beginning because I think sleep is such a huge impactor for many of us who are struggling with hormone issues, right? And it's a double-edged sword. If your cortisol is off, chances are you're not sleeping well at night. And if you're ever tracking it, you'll just have a better idea of really how much deep sleep are you getting, how much REM sleep are you getting, and they're equally important. So our deep sleep is going to help our physical recovery. Our REM sleep is going to help our mental recovery, and those happen at different phases throughout the night. So making sure that we're getting in bed at the same time, right? Having a good routine, getting rid of the screen time and the blue light a couple of hours before bed, or at least an hour. Setting up your room for success. Early on in COVID, I had worked with a lot of women who were struggling, and what I found was moving your office, you work from home, into your bedroom is oftentimes a challenge because now you wouldn't sleep at the office. Well, most of us wouldn't, right? So you're going to have a situation where your body is confused because at one point I'm asking it to do its best performance in this environment. And the next minute I'm asking it to shut off and go to sleep. And so that's not always something we can help, but being cognizant that that might be impacting your sleep routine and your body's ability to know when it's time to sleep, just like we do with our kids, right? We set them up with a bath and books and whatever it is for their nighttime routine. We should be doing something similar for our own bodies, tracking what kind of sleep we're getting, and then aiming for that 7 to 9 hours a night. I can speak to this personally. Last year, I went through a really stressful time. So know all the things I do and do this all the time, right? And still, I had a period where my cortisol was really high. And I started noticing my sleep was really sucking. I was not getting enough rest. I wasn't feeling rested during the day. My workouts were tanking. My body just felt terrible. And I had to go back to the basics, went back to the stress management, went back to the sleep and tracking that and getting the right things, and was able to recover this and get that deep sleep and that REM sleep that was needed, the number of hours needed, and then was able to start feeling better, get my cortisol back in check, increase the exercise, right? So all that to say, even if you know exactly what you're doing, there's still going to be times in your life where you have to kind of really be intentional about these things and think, which of these things do I need to do first? Where do I need to focus? And how can I start today to start improving these things? The last piece that I want to talk about is our supplements and different supplements that we might want to use. And so when it comes to sleep, oftentimes magnesium comes up a lot. And that might be one that's helpful there as well. Magnesium also can help a lot with gut health. It can help with relaxation, being regular. There's a whole lot of things that go into that. And there's a whole lot of ways that stress in general depletes magnesium from our bodies. And so magnesium is something that oftentimes I see women needing more of. There's a lot of different forms of it out there. And so it's really going to depend on what you need support for specifically as to which form is going to be best for you. And then just a word about supplements in general, because magnesium is one that I find this with a lot. Buying from a reputable source. So if you're getting them on Amazon, actually, it's a staggering 70% aren't actually what they're packaged to say they're packaged. So if you're not buying directly from the manufacturer, that's one way you can get around that on Amazon is making sure you're actually ordering from the source. Otherwise, ordering from like a supplement type store like Full Script, which we use a lot. So other ones that come in and are commonly missing, vitamin B can have a lot to do with energy and just a lot of our detox processes. As we looked at that big graph with all those pieces earlier, vitamin B or different B vitamins are cofactors in a lot of those processes. Vitamin D, created by the sunlight, many of us are not getting enough sunlight or enough healthy fats. So salmon or cold water fish is another good source of vitamin D. And we just realistically aren't eating, you know, fresh caught fish or getting out in the sun enough. And so oftentimes those things can contribute. And vitamin D in and of itself is a hormone. So it can impact a lot of other things in our body. So what comes back on lab testing is okay, might be okay for some, but if we're having symptoms of hormone problems, vitamin D might be another one that needs to be supplemented. Probiotics to give that gut microbiome the best impact. And again, like I said, we're really learning that there's so many different strains out there that we can kind of tailor to an individual's symptoms. So probiotics might be a way to reseed what's in there and then to continue to grow that with a good diet through our phytonutrients. And again, if we aren't getting enough in our diet, there are some really good green spotters out there. It's certainly not my first recommendation, but if that's something that we're struggling with and we really need to get more of those antioxidants and phytonutrients in, then that might be something to supplement as well. And then the last common one I see for a lot of folks is our omegas. And so omegas are just going to help bring that ratio of healthy fats into where it should be, which brings down inflammation in our body. Like I said earlier, any of our processed foods oftentimes have our poor choices of fats in them. And so if you are getting enough omegas in, then you can balance that ratio out. Ideally, we want to get rid of the not so great fats, but most of us need more of the good fats as well. And then there's some others when it comes to hormone regulation. I'm sure many of you have heard things like red wine, and that can be true. It's specifically the resveratrol in it that can be very helpful, and that is found in other things as well. So, like your berries are good for that. Any of your like bright colored fruits are good for that. Curcumin can be good to bring down inflammation as well, and NAC is another one we hear a lot with that. Green tea, selenium, just lots of different things that you might have heard. This might be helpful for my hormones. And I think at the end of the day, it's so personalized, right? And that's the point of this is it's not a one size fits all approach. If we really know what's happening with you personally through both your clinical presentation and what you're feeling, whether that's period symptoms or low sex drive or low energy, we can really come to a plan specific for you. So, in summary, if it looks like a duck, meaning if you're feeling all of those symptoms we just talked about, getting to the root cause is important because maybe your labs are fine or all that traditional medicine has offered you is another pill to cover it. But we can really get to the root of what's going on with you, find out where maybe you're lacking either in those lifestyle factors, in the diet factors, in whatever that's causing your hormones to be off. And then come up with a program that's going to support you to getting to that symptom management, getting past that, which can be so debilitating, but coming to a place where, like I said, you've got energy left in your day, you're feeling strong in your workouts, mental clarity, rested when you wake up in the morning, and all of that comes back so many times to the hormone issues we talked about today. So I want to leave you with this quote. It's important to understand the imbalance of your body's basic systems and restore balance than it is to name the symptoms and match a pill with an ill. And this is Dr. Mark Hyman, who is really kind of one of the fathers and forefounders of functional medicine. And I couldn't agree with this more, right? It's one thing to say, here's a symptom, we can give you something for it, but let's get to the root cause of why you feel that way and come up with a solution for good. And so if you're ready to learn more and take control of your health in some of these aspects, here is the QR code. We can talk at the end, and I will certainly post the link for those of you who are watching this later as well to book a call. Let's come up with a plan for you and take the guesswork out of what's going on with your health. All right. So with that, thank you so much for listening today. I'm going to stop this and we can ask some questions. Let me stop recording here.